Patient Zero, Chapter 3. Did the Mosquito Do It? Yellow Fever in Cuba, 1900. You know, James, I've never thought of myself as sentimental, but I can't help feeling sorry for these poor creatures we are experimenting on. Take this old lady, for example. She spent her whole life in captivity. She hasn't had a good meal in days. No wonder she's so weak and listless. As he spoke, Dr. Jesse Lazier lifted a test tube up to the light and tapped it gently, dislodging the mosquito inside from her perch on the side of the tube. Briefly, the insect lifted into the air, but she soon settled back down to cling to the slippery glass walls of her prison, her wings drooping. "You're right, Jesse," observed his lab companion, Dr. James Carroll. "That little skeeter looks like she's on her last legs. Not much pep left in her, is there?" Dr. Jesse Lazier smiled grimly. "She's not going to live out the day, in my opinion, unless, that is, somebody can tempt her to feed on them. She's been a fever patient 12 days ago, and she's had nothing since then. She couldn't muster the energy to bite this morning's volunteer. I need another willing victim." The two men looked at each other across the battered wooden lab table. In the silence, even the trapped mosquito seemed to be waiting to hear what would happen next. James cleared his throat. "She'll die today unless she feeds, you say?" he asked. "Yes, and she's almost the last hatch from that batch of eggs Dr. Finlay gave us. When they're gone, we'll have to find more eggs and raise the insects from larvae again. And it's such a chore. But the worst of it is that it will set our experiments back by days, waiting for new mosquitoes to reach maturity." James took a deep breath and started rolling up his shirt sleeve. "Bring that test tube over here, and we'll see if her ladyship likes the taste of me." When his friend hesitated, James laughed. "Come on, Jesse, you know as well as I do that yellow fever isn't transmitted by mosquitoes. That little imp is going to do nothing more than give me an itchy lump for a day or two. Then we'll be able to stop these foolish experiments and get back to the real work, finding the bacteria that causes the disease." Reluctantly, Jesse Lazier picked up the test tube, pulled out the stopper, and jammed the mouth of the tube against his friend's bare arm. The mosquito fluttered aimlessly up and down, then came to rest on the side of the test tube. Jesse rolled his eyes, sighing in exasperation. Just like this morning, too weak to feed, he started to withdraw the test tube from James' arm. "Be patient, man. Give the lady a chance to make up her mind. Maybe she's picking out the tastiest spot." After several minutes more of waiting and watching, Jesse gave up, leaving the test tube and its indecisive inhabitant to the care of James. James sat patiently, holding the tube to his forearm, silently willing the mosquito to lift up from her perch. Finally, he announced, "Success! She's done it, Jesse. She's done it." And that was the end of it. A few minutes out of a busy afternoon's work to make sure that an experiment stayed on schedule. James had soon put the whole thing out of his mind. The bite didn't even itch. The Cuban experiments. Jesse Lazier and James Carroll hadn't come to Cuba just to raise mosquitoes. Their assignment was much bigger. Find the cause of yellow fever, one of the most feared and deadly diseases of the country. As their ship sailed into the great harbor of Havana, the capital city of Cuba, both Jesse and James had been on deck, eager to get their first sight of the famously beautiful island. Above the city rose green hills covered with waving palm and coconut trees, while the harbor was guarded by immense stone fortifications. Inside the city walls, they could glimpse gaily painted homes, the tall spires of churches, and the elaborately decorated buildings that had given the city the name Ciudad de las Columnas, City of the Columns. In the middle of the harbor, rising out of the water, was the black hulk of a destroyed ship. It was the wreck of the Maine, a U.S. Army ship that had been blown up by the Spanish 2 years earlier, killing more than 260 sailors on board and setting off the bitterly fought Spanish-American War. The two doctors had often heard the rallying cry echo through the United States. Remember the Maine, to hell with Spain. Now here it was before them, the ruined ship that had put their country on the path to war, a conflict that had resulted in the victorious U.S. taking control of the Spanish island of Cuba. In 1900, there were more than 50,000 American soldiers occupying Cuba, and the Army was worried. The war might be over, but their troops were still dying of yellow fever. In fact, already more soldiers had been lost to yellow fever than had been killed in the fighting. And with ships full of soldiers coming and going constantly between the island and the nearby American mainland, the risk of a sick soldier setting off an epidemic in an American city was growing by the day. It was a risk the U.S. Army was determined to put a stop to. Terrible epidemics of yellow fever had ravaged cities across the United States all through the 18th and 19th centuries, with the sickness becoming known and feared as the Yellow Death. During a single epidemic in Philadelphia in 1793, 10% of the city's population had died. New Orleans was even more unlucky. The city had suffered 6 major epidemics since by 1878, when it was hit again, along with 131 other cities and towns in the U.S. Nowhere, it seemed, was safe from the menace of the Yellow Death. But in Cuba, the U.S. Army was seizing the chance to solve the mystery of yellow fever once and for all. The fever fighters. Along with James Carroll and Jesse Lazier, the U.S. Army had sent 2 other doctors to Cuba, Major Walter Reed, who would lead the team, and Aristides Argamonte would assist him. Walter and James were bacteriologists, specialists in uncovering the causes of diseases and developing the cures or treatments. Jesse Lazier was the head of the clinical laboratory at Johns Hopkins University in Baltimore, and Aristides Argamonte was an experienced medical investigator. At Camp Columbia, the U.S. Army's main base in Cuba, the team's mission was simple: find the cause of yellow fever. Simple but incredibly risky. By agreeing to the assignment, each of the men knew he was putting himself at risk. Year after year, yellow fever took a terrible toll on the people of Cuba, killing hundreds or even thousands. It started with chills and a fever, a crushing headache, and aching pains in the legs and back. But in some cases, the fever progressed to a second stage, increasing until the victim's temperature reached 40 degrees Celsius, 104 degrees Fahrenheit, or more. Then the skin and the whites of the eyes began to turn yellow or jaundiced as the disease attacked the liver. This frightening symptom gave the yellow fever its name. Next, the victims would begin to vomit black, clotted blood. Within 2 weeks, half of the patients who developed the second stage of the fever died. Yellow fever snuck up on its victims mysteriously. Did you get it from contact with infected clothes or bedding? Did yellow fever germs travel from person to person through the air? Could it be transmitted through contaminated water or food? Every doctor and scientist studying the disease had a favorite theory, and there was very little hard evidence for or against any of them. That's why Walter Reed was determined that his team would follow the strictest standards of scientific inquiry. Their experiments had to be foolproof, and the results had to stand the test of time. There had been other investigations into the causes of the Yellow Death, but Walter and his fellow doctors wanted theirs to be the last. Home at Camp Columbia. In late June 1900, on the spacious veranda of their new quarters at Columbia Barracks Hospital, the team met to plan their strategy. The summer rains were beginning, and they knew it meant that soon the hospital beds would fill with yellow fever patients. The doctors decided to test 3 theories about how the disease spread. At that time, many people believed that yellow fever could be transmitted through contact with infected clothing and bedding. The team agreed to design experiments that would expose people to clothes that had been worn by yellow fever patients to test his theory. An Italian researcher, Dr. Giuseppe Santarelli, claimed to have found a bacteria that caused yellow fever, Bacillus icterioides. To test these claims, the teams planned to perform autopsies on yellow fever victims, remove tissue samples, and try to grow the bacteria from samples. James Carroll's skills as a bacteriologist would be essential to those experiments. For their third set of experiments, they decided to investigate a little-known theory from a Cuban doctor. For over 20 years, Dr. Carlos Finlay had been trying to prove that mosquitoes spread yellow fever in humans. Most people considered this a far-fetched idea, but Walter and his fellow disease detectives were determined to follow every lead. They would test Dr. Finlay's theory as well. Fighting fever. Before people understood that mosquitoes spread yellow fever, stopping an epidemic was almost impossible. In 1793, when yellow fever broke out in Philadelphia, doctors gave the best advice they had. Avoid fatigue of body and mind. Don't stand or sit in a draft, in the sun, or in the evening air. Dress according to the weather. Avoid intemperance. Drink sparingly of wine, beer, or cider. When visiting the sick, use vinegar or camphor on your handkerchief. Carry it in smelling bottles. Use it frequently. Place your patients in the center of your biggest, airiest rooms and beds without curtains. Burn gunpowder. It clears the air. None of it worked. The epidemic killed 5,000 people in just 3 months, stopping only when a fall cold snap froze the mosquito larvae breeding in puddles and swamps around the city. Into Havana. To learn more about Dr. Finlay's yellow fever mosquito experiments, Walter Reed's team set off to visit him in Havana. As their horse-drawn carriage jolted across along the rutted dirt roads into the city, it seemed unlikely that groundbreaking scientific research could be happening in a sleepy backwater like Cuba. But while they had little faith in the Cuban doctor's theories, they were determined to explore every possibility. White-bearded, bespectacled Dr. Finlay welcomed them graciously, but there wasn't much small talk among the 5 medical men that night. Carlos Finlay got right to the point, describing his efforts to prove that mosquitoes spread yellow fever. He'd conducted no less than 103 experiments, exposing human volunteers to the bites of mosquitoes to see if they developed the disease. But his results were ignored because he hadn't kept his volunteers in isolation. Scientists pointed out that they could just as easily have picked up yellow fever from another person as from the mosquito bite. Carlos begged Walter and the others to complete his work. He explained that when a mosquito bites a person, it pierces their skin with its proboscis or long, thin nose to suck up blood. And when the mosquito's victim is a yellow fever patient, their blood is infected with the microbes that cause the disease. Then, when the mosquito bites someone else, it transmits those microbes, causing yellow fever. As the team left, Carlos pressed a small bowl into Jesse Lazier's hands. Mosquito eggs, he explained. In 2 weeks, you'll have a lovely batch of insects to work with. Good luck. Back in their barracks that night, the 4 Americans lay awake for hours, replaying Carlos' argument in their minds. Were mosquitoes the answer to the yellow fever mystery after all? The next morning, they agreed. They would start testing the mosquito theory immediately. Right away, they ran into a problem. In order to test Dr. Finlay's theory that mosquitoes spread yellow fever, they would need to have mosquitoes bite patients suffering from yellow fever and then bite healthy people. If the theory was correct, their healthy test subjects would develop yellow fever. People could die from their experiments. The doctors agreed that they could not ask the soldiers at Camp Columbia or Cubans in the surrounding area to take such a risk, unless they were also prepared to put their own lives on the line. 3 weeks later, on August 27th, Jesse Lazier put the mosquito on his friend James Carroll's arm. Troubles accumulate. For 3 days, James showed no effects from his mosquito bite. He carried on as usual, examining tissue samples under the microscope, looking for evidence of Dr. Santarelli's Bacillus icteroides in yellow fever patients. Of all the team members, James was the least convinced by the mosquito transmission theory. He was sure the answer to the yellow fever mystery would be found under the microscope, not by breeding insects. But on August 30th, James began feeling feverish. He and Jesse went for a swim that afternoon to cool off. And when James emerged from the water, he started shaking, and soon he developed a blinding headache. Another army doctor looked him over and told him bluntly that he had yellow fever. James didn't believe him, and he carried on working. Yet by the next afternoon, James was lying in the yellow fever ward in Camp Columbia's hospital with a temperature of 39 degrees Celsius, 102 degrees Fahrenheit. And there was no longer any question about what was making him so ill. The research team was in shock and unsure what to do next. Walter Reed had just returned to the United States to complete a research report on an earlier study he had been involved in. Jesse and Aristides sent him a cable letting him know about James. Overcome with guilt, Walter wrote to a friend, "I cannot begin to describe my mental distress and depression over this most unfortunate turn of affairs. We had all determined to experiment on ourselves, and I should have taken the same dose had I been there. Can it be that this was the source of his infection?" Fortunately, James' case of yellow fever wasn't fatal. Soon, he was well enough to read a congratulatory letter from Walter. "Hip, hip, hooray! God be praised for the news from Cuba today. Really, I can never recall such a sense of relief in all my life as the news of your recovery gives me. God bless you, my boy." On the back of the envelope, Walter had scribbled the question that was now foremost in all of their minds. Did the mosquito do it? The evidence seemed to point to the mosquito, but the scientists weren't quite convinced. James could have been infected through his exposure to yellow fever patients in the hospital or through his work with infected tissue samples in the laboratory. The research team needed more evidence. They needed to see if a mosquito could cause yellow fever in another volunteer. But who would volunteer for such a hazardous duty? The solution, as it turned out, stopped by their laboratory later that day. Private William Dean was new at Camp Columbia and to Cuba. He'd never been exposed to any yellow fever patients, and he was curious about the unusual experiments he'd heard was going on in the ramshackle laboratory. When William passed the door to the lab that day, he glanced in and happened to meet Jesse's eye. "You still fooling with mosquitoes, doctor?" William asked. "Yes," said Jesse. "Will you take a bite?" "Sure, I ain't scared of 'em." A week later, Aristides burst into the lab with the news that Private Dean had been admitted that morning to the camp hospital with fever, chills, and a headache, the classic early symptoms of yellow fever. Could this be the evidence they needed? Human guinea pigs. Private William Dean had a mild case of yellow fever, and he was soon on the road to recovery. With James Carroll also slowly recovering and the evidence against the mosquitoes mounting, everything seemed to be going well for the research team. Then disaster struck. Jesse Lazier came down with yellow fever. How had it happened? Jesse insisted it was accidental. He had been holding a test tube against a patient when a wild mosquito landed on his hand. Rather than risk letting the mosquito in the test tube escape, Jesse had allowed the wild mosquito to bite him, confident he was immune to yellow fever. That's what he told his colleagues as he lay in his bed in one of the hospital's fever wards. But later, as they were going through their research notes, James and Aristides came across a puzzling entry in Jesse's handwriting. September 30th. This guinea pig bitten today by a mosquito, which developed from egg laid by a mosquito, which bit Tanner. August 6th. This mosquito bit Suarez. August 30th. Hernandez. September 2nd. DeLong. September 7th. Fernandez. September 10th. Who was the guinea pig? Could the note mean that Jesse had decided to experiment on himself, allowing mosquitoes to bite him after feeding on fever patients? Before they could confront him with their suspicions, however, Dr. Jesse Lazier died of yellow fever just 10 days after being bitten. That bites. As anyone who's ever spent a hot summer night in a cottage, cabin, or tent can tell you, nothing keeps you awake at night like mosquitoes buzzing in your ear. And the next day, boy, these bites really itch. Usually, the urge to scratch for a few days is our only lasting reminder of an unpleasant encounter with a mosquito. But if you're not so lucky, the effects of a mosquito bite can be worse than an itchy lump, much worse. In addition to yellow fever, mosquitoes spread a number of dangerous, even deadly, diseases among humans. Depending on where you live, these include malaria, dengue fever, Rift Valley fever, West Nile virus, and encephalitis. It is estimated that mosquitoes transmit these diseases to an astounding 700 million people every year. Reed returns. Walter Reed raced back to Cuba, only to find his research team in chaos. Jesse was dead, James was still very weak from his bout of yellow fever, and Aristides was deeply upset by what had befallen his colleagues. Yet, despite all the suffering, important scientific work had been done, possibly enough to establish how yellow fever was transmitted. Walter got right to work by interviewing William Dean. To prove that the mosquito bite had led to William's illness, it was important to demonstrate that the bite was his only exposure to the disease. William insisted that he hadn't left Camp Columbia and that he hadn't been in the hospital's fever wards. It looked like an open and shut case. A month later, on October 23rd, Walter Reed delivered a report to the American Public Health Association describing his team's experiments in Cuba and their conclusion. The mosquito serves as an immediate host, the carrier, for yellow fever. The medical community was unconvinced. A single case wasn't enough to prove anything, they told Walter. He needed to test and retest, and his experiments needed to be more carefully controlled so that it was clear his research subjects were exposed to yellow fever only through the mosquito bite. The scientists who listened to Walter's report had been respectful, but not everyone took his theory seriously. An article in the Washington Post called the mosquito theory silly and nonsensical rigmarole. The ridicule only made Walter more determined. He boarded his ship back to Cuba, swearing that he wouldn't leave again until he'd proven beyond a shadow of a doubt that mosquitoes spread yellow fever. $100 in American gold. Back at Camp Columbia, Walter convinced the Governor General of Cuba to give his team $10,000 to fund their experiments, the equivalent of nearly $250,000 today. They used it to build special cabins away from the rest of the camp to keep their research subjects isolated during experiments. The new research area was called Camp Lazier, in honor of Jesse Lazier's sacrifice. But the research team still hadn't decided one thing: who would participate in the experiments? The 3 remaining doctors talked it through again and again. Despite the dangers, it still seemed as if the only way to solve the mystery was to use human volunteers. This time around, though, they would make sure that everyone who volunteered was aware that they were risking their lives. They decided to only accept participants who were young, because yellow fever was more dangerous in older people, healthy and single, so that the experiments would not end with widows or orphan children. Men who agreed to participate in the experiments would earn $100 in gold. That's the equivalent of more than $3,000 today. If they got sick with yellow fever, they would get another $100. For the U.S. soldiers and for the poor Cubans and Spanish immigrants in the area, that was a very tempting offer. Soon, the research team had a lineup of willing volunteers. By the end of November, Camp Lazier was ready for its guests. The camp was really just a patch of land outside Camp Columbia, with tents for the researchers and 2 wooden cabins where the test subjects would stay during the experiments. Barbed wire fences kept visitors away from the quarantine zone. First, the researchers tested their yellow fever could be transmitted through clothing, as many people believed. 3 volunteers put on the filthy nightclothes and underwear that had been worn by yellow fever patients, and they slept in beds covered with sheets and blankets from the fever hospital. Neither the clothing nor the sheets had been washed. They were still covered in urine, feces, vomit, and blood from the terribly sick people who had used them last. For 3 weeks, the men stayed in the cabin. At the end of that time, no one had developed yellow fever. They repeated the experiment 3 times with different volunteers. Each time, the men emerged from their ordeal free from yellow fever. The team had proven that one of the most widespread beliefs about yellow fever was wrong. For their next experiment, they had built a cabin with a fine wire mesh screen running down the middle, splitting the interior into 2 isolated halves. On December 21st, the researchers released 15 mosquitoes that had previously bitten fever patients into one half of the cabin. A volunteer was admitted into the midst of the buzzing insects. At the same time, by a separate door, 2 other volunteers entered the adjoining section of the cabin, the mosquito-free zone. The 3 men stayed in the cabin together, yet separated, for 2 days. The unlucky man in the mosquito zone was bitten again and again. After 2 days, the bitten man returned to his tent, while the 2 other volunteers stayed on in the cabin. The doctors closely monitored the bitten volunteer. On Christmas Day, Walter Reed stopped by the man's tent to check on him. The volunteer, Private John Moran, was lying in bed, his face flushed, his temperature scorching 39 degrees Celsius, 102 degrees Fahrenheit. He had yellow fever. The 2 volunteers in the mosquito-free zone remained completely healthy. Victory! Because the men had been kept in isolation throughout the experiment, it was clear at last that mosquitoes transmitted yellow fever between humans. Luckily, Moran made a complete recovery. Tool of the trade, human experiments. Walter Reed knew that to test the theory that mosquitoes transmit yellow fever, he would have to experiment on humans and that some of them might die. He wanted every volunteer to understand the risks. The forms he asked all the volunteer subjects to sign are among the earliest examples of informed consent. Not all experiments on humans have been as ethical. During World War II, the Nazis subjected prisoners to cruel experiments. To prevent it from happening in the future, an international agreement called the Nuremberg Code was developed. Under the code, researchers must have the consent of their research subjects, and experiments must be well designed and safe. Even then, researchers experimenting on humans didn't always follow the rules. In one study in the United States, Black American farm workers who were suffering from syphilis were told that they would get free medical treatment. Instead, researchers from the U.S. Public Health Service observed them as they got sicker and sicker in order to learn more about the disease. The World Medical Association now requires studies with human subjects to meet high standards of ethical practice. Ethics committees at universities and research institutions review research plans before approving funding, and the principle of informed consent that Walter Reed pioneered in Cuba is central to the design of experiments with human participants. The future of yellow fever. Thanks to the Reed Commission, yellow fever epidemics in Cuba and the U.S. came to an end. Screens and bug repellent help keep mosquitoes at bay, and most people live in cities with water and sanitation systems, so there is less standing water around for mosquitoes to lay eggs in. But even today, yellow fever is still a threat in many parts of South America and Africa. Approximately 200,000 people come down with yellow fever each year, and up to 30,000 die from the disease, and that number is growing. The Aedes aegypti mosquito, which spreads the disease through its bites, is emerging in cities where it has not been seen for years. A small, dark mosquito with white markings on its legs, the Aedes aegypti mosquito prefers areas without clean water and sanitation systems. One scientist in Australia has a plan to wipe out yellow fever and other diseases spread by mosquitoes. Scott O'Neill has bred a strain of mosquitoes loaded with harmless bacteria called Wolbachia. The bacteria compete with the virus, making it hard for the viruses to reproduce inside the mosquito. That makes it much less likely the mosquitoes can spread the viruses to people. O'Neill first released his specially bred mosquitoes in backyards in Queensland, Australia, hoping that they would breed with wild mosquitoes and pass along the Wolbachia bacteria to their offspring. It worked. Danube fever was almost disappeared from Queensland. O'Neill's World Mosquito Program is now releasing the Wolbachia-carrying mosquitoes in countries around the globe. Clara Mass, volunteer or victim. Most of the people who volunteered to take part in the Reed Commission's experiments on yellow fever were men, either American soldiers or local Cubans. The lure of the $100 in gold was enough to overcome their fear of getting yellow fever, and they were assured of good medical care if they did get sick during the experiments, which was more than they could expect if they contracted the disease on their own. But at least one woman volunteered for the experiments, Clara Mass, and she wasn't doing it for the money. Clara was an Army nurse who had seen firsthand the ravages of yellow fever in the Philippines and Cuba. She wanted to join the fight against the disease. Clara was bitten by a mosquito that had fed on yellow fever patients. She developed a mild case of yellow fever from which she recovered. Then, several months later, she agreed to be bitten again to test whether she had developed an immunity to the disease. She hadn't. Clara Mass died of yellow fever in the summer of 1901. Her death caused a massive public outcry in the United States and put an end to yellow fever experiments using human subjects. But as a nurse, Clara Mass understood the risks she was taking. She wanted to be part of the effort to stop yellow fever, even if it meant she lost her own life. In 1936, Dr. Max Thieler, a virologist working at the Rockefeller Foundation in New York, developed the first successful vaccine against yellow fever. Over the next 10 years, the Rockefeller Foundation made more than 28 million doses of the vaccine and distributed them around the world. Thelier, who caught yellow fever himself while working on the vaccine but luckily survived, won the Nobel Prize in Physiology or Medicine in 1951 for his achievement. It is often said that vaccines save lives, but it's really vaccination that is the lifesaver. A vaccine that stays in the test tube isn't any good at stopping disease. There's a good vaccine for yellow fever, but the fact that people are still getting sick and dying from the disease has more to do with social and economic justice than with science. To save lives, the vaccine needs to go from the lab to the manufacturer, onto airplanes, across borders, through customs, into warehouses, and then to clinics, and sometimes even right to the homes of the people who need it most. To stop an outbreak, healthcare workers need to be trained and equipped to deliver the vaccine. Only then can the vaccine do its work of preventing disease. Vaccination protects the whole community. A disease can't spread from an infected person if everyone around them has been vaccinated and is now immune. There are now vaccines available for more than 100 infectious diseases. Mosquitoes beware, ships coming through. The Panama Canal is one of the world's best shortcuts, giving ships a quick route between the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans. Nearly 14,000 ships use the 80-kilometer, 50-mile canal every year, and it nearly didn't get built because of mosquitoes. Hot, swampy, and rainy for much of the year, Panama is a mosquito paradise. But for the canal builders, it was hell. Between 1881 and 1889, more than 22,000 workers died of yellow fever. And by 1906, almost 85% of the workers had been hospitalized for yellow fever. To end the epidemic, the U.S. sent Dr. William Gorgas, who had practically eliminated mosquitoes in Cuba after Walter Reed's discovery that they transmitted yellow fever. To get rid of Panama's mosquitoes, Gorgas drained swamps along the canal route, put screens on the windows of the workers' homes, and made sure all the houses had running water. It worked. The first ship crossed the canal in 1914, just before the start of World War I. The world's great shortcut also gave a boost to the next great disease outbreak, the Spanish flu pandemic of 1918. Faster travel and increased trade helped the influenza virus spread across the world. It was a pattern that would continue throughout the 20th century and into the 21st. More travel, more trade, more epidemics.